For those of you who have just joined us, Cyber Science 2020 is a multidisciplinary conference. It's has been running for a number of years now, and the conference mostly focuses on cybersecurity and cyber situational awareness. This year, we were supposed to have this conference hosted in Dublin City University, but due to the recent COVID-19 situation, we had decided to move this virtually. And I think we were surprised by the positive response of the community. We have people joining us from all over the world, and I think this is very exciting. The conference will started this morning and around 11 o'clock Irish time or UK time, and will go on until next Friday. So feel free to check the calendar of different talks and so on, and to join us anytime you can during the week. Welcome also to those of you who are joining us, who are just watching the live streaming video online on different social media platforms. So for the theme of the day for cyber science is advancing a multidisciplinary approach to cybersecurity. We had two tracks today. One is called Critical National Infrastructure and Certs, and track 2 is called Cyber Attacks, SOCs, and Deception. And it's my pleasure to introduce you our first keynote speaker at the conference, Dr. Ruoyi Zhou. I hope that I pronounced that correctly. She's the director of IBM Research Ireland. She has a long-lasting career in IBM, mostly in the US. And then I guess she was probably tired of too much sunshine in the west coast of the US and decided to move to Ireland. So most of her work focuses around artificial intelligence, Internet of Things, high performance computing, and quantum computing. So I can't think about more exciting topics, to be honest. Dr. Ruoyi Zhou has a PhD in material science, and she was YWCA Twin Award honoree, so a very prestigious award for women for recognizing their achievement in the US. And she's gonna present us, the title of her talk today is AI in a privacy-aware world. So welcome, Dr. Ruoyi Zhou. It's my pleasure to welcome you to Cyber Science, and I'm very excited to hear your speech today. So we have an hour for the session. For the attendees, if you have any questions, please type them anytime you want in the Q&A that you can see at the bottom of your screen. We will probably have, roughly speaking, 15 minutes for Q&A at the end, more or less. So I'll hand over to you, Ruoyi, and thanks again for accepting our invitation. Sorry, Ruoyi, you are on mute. The tech support might help you unmute mute yourself.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes.
Okay, so would you please also hand over, okay, so I have the control of the slide. Okay, so sorry about this.
All right, no problem,
Right.
Thank you.
So thank you very much, Piangelo, for your kind introduction, and hi everyone, and thanks for attending this session during pandemic, and I hope you and your family are all safe and doing well. As Piangelo said, yes, I moved from Silicon Valley to Dublin. I would say Dublin is the Silicon Valley of Europe about a year ago, and fall in love with this place here. Sunshine every single day almost, right, in the last 2 months or so, so very fortunate to be here with you. So today, what I'd like to do is to share some of the work we are doing, especially in the AI and the privacy-aware world. So what I'd like to do is to break down my presentation into 3 sections. I'd like to cover the technology landscape in AI and data, and then also share with you some of the challenges we're all facing, and also then talk about the technology can overcome these challenges. But before I start on these topics, I'd like also spend a few minutes also to share with you a quick introduction about the institute that I work for, that is IBM Research. So IBM as a corporation, we essentially, we started 108 years ago, and we have over 300,000 employees. So IBM Research is a relatively small organization compared with our very big organization, right? So research started back in 1945. And so over the last 75 years, we grew from a very small team in New York now to an organization that has 3,000 researchers in 19 locations across 6 continents. We're missing 1 continent, but that's good enough, right? And also, I would say to me, the most important location, of course, is right here in Dublin. And over the last 70 plus years or so, our work have been well recognized around the world. Those include 6 Nobel Prize, 6 Turing Awards, 10 Medals of Technology, and 5 National Medals of Science. So it's a quite, I would say, impressive research organization. And in terms of disciplines, I also like to share with you what kind of disciplines we have within IBM Research. Back 75 years ago, we started with a few disciplines. Back then, of course, you don't have that many disciplines, right? So we started with mathematics, physics, chemistry. And over the years, we added, say, electrical engineering, material science, later on computer science. But today, if you take a look at it, we have multiple disciplines support IBM strategic directions that our CEO just announced a month ago. Those include hybrid cloud, AI, 5G, quantum computing, and also security. So therefore, if you take a look at the disciplines we have today, it really well covers the strategic important areas that matters to IBM and also matters to the world as well. So this sort of gives you some ideas in terms of the depth and the breadth of IBM Research, and also the kind of innovation and also creativity, the culture that we have. Okay, so that's give you, as I said, a quick overview about IBM Research. Now let's take a look at it, the landscape of AI and data. So I'll start with AI. So AI as a research topic was proposed back in 1955. And the project got started as a summer research project in 1956. The participants included Dartmouth College in US, Harvard University, Bell Labs, and IBM. And so, it's a long journey, but most of the progress was actually made in the last 10, 15 years or so. And the earliest stage between 2010 and 2015, people call it narrow AI. By definition, means computers or AIs can do very simple tasks, such as recognizing the imaging, right? And so can organize your photo album on your phone, or in the manufacturing setting, it can pick the defects in production lines. Those are very narrow. And so it can do repetitive work very precisely and very efficient. So that's the essentially, the left-hand side. You go to the far right, then people also talking about general AI. There are a lot of controversial discussions about what is general AI. Is it true that by then AI is going to replace human being? A lot of speculation. Some people even say the doomsday, right? So I'm not going to debate about that because who knows what's going to happen down the road. But I think what's real is what's in the middle. That is broad AI. And so broad AI, we're still in the early stage of the broad AI, which means AI can solve many problems in the society and also in the industry. So it becomes solutions. For example, can we use AI to assist the medical doctors for treatment, for recommendations, for interventions, right? Can we use AI to do, say, predictive maintenance in the industrial settings? So that's essentially where we are. So if you take a look at it, like or not, AI is already in our everyday life, making very important decisions, such as in the legal system, right? Such as a college admission or application process, such as employment when you apply for a job, and many companies using AI to do resume screening and to match a skill with the position openings. And in financial services, when you apply for a credit card, when you apply for bank loans, very often the bank probably use AI algorithms to see whether or not you qualify. Of course, in enterprise, many of the workflows have AIs embedded. Even though, yes, we can see AI is already in our everyday life, but there's still a lot of work need to be done. So let's take a look at it. What's ahead of us in order for us to make use of the broad AI? As I mentioned, we're still in the earliest stage of a broad AI. We still need to continue advanced AI, especially some of the core AI technology, such as learning, such as reasoning, natural language processing, which is very important, computer vision, speech recognition. We realize it's already there, right? But it's still not sufficient yet. AI planning, and also how can we build AI models with less data? And also, how do we do transfer learning? All these basic functions are still very much need a lot of work. Another aspect is scaling AI, because we simply don't have enough trained AI scientists or AI engineers to do the work. So the question is, how can we democratize AI to make development of AI faster, safer, easier, more repeatable, and more importantly, how can we make it accessible for non-AI experts, right? So that's very important, you know, in terms of scaling, advancing. For most technologies, we are familiar with, yes, you need to further advance technology. Yes, you need to scale. You hardly hear about, okay, can you trust a certain technology? When it comes to AI, trust is a very important aspect. And why is that? Because as I said, you know, people are talking about doomsday, people are concerned about, you know, whether or not people can use AI for evil. But there was more than that. So within the AI, trusting AI, you're talking about how can you explain the AI model or the outcome the AI model generates, right? It's not really like a black box, data in, results out, without be able to explain why you receive such data. So explainability is very, very important for the adoption of AI. That's one aspect. Another aspect of trusting AI is fairness. As you know that our society is full of bias. As human, are we going to introduce such bias into AI models, which will exacerbate the bias in our society? So how can you make sure that we collect the data, we make sure data is fair and also cover all, you know, different people, different aspects. And so we essentially make sure the AI models can correct the human bias. Let me give you an example, because I mean, prior to this particular job I have now, I spent 3 years working in the accessibility research. What does that mean, accessibility research? My job was to make sure that people with disabilities, blind, deaf, in wheelchairs, they can use IBM technology. They can access technology without being shunned away from technology. And quite often when we look at AI, we found the data from people with disabilities are missing. So those other people need AI the most, but those other people won't get the benefit if we're not careful, if we don't intentionally make sure the data from people with disability or disadvantaged group are included in the AI. So fairness is an extremely important aspect of AI, because we don't want, as I said, we don't want to introduce the bias, societal bias, human bias into AI models, make situation worse. So that's the second aspect of fairness, of trusting AI. The third aspect is robustness. How robust are the AI models so we can essentially avoid malicious attacks or sometimes human error? So, you know, these are the three aspects in order for us to, you know, make more advanced in the broad AI era. So now talking about advanced AI, scale AI, make sure that we build a trusted AI, it is very, very important that we have data. No data, no AI. So there are good news and bad news when it comes to data. So this is the a diagram I got from IDC report. And so, as I said, the good news and bad news. The good news is that the data is growing at an exponential rate. So according to IDC, by 2025, we're gonna have more than 173 zettabytes of data. What is a zettabyte? A zettabyte is 1 to 10 to 21st power bytes. It's a tremendously large number. So we're gonna have lots and lots of data. Now let's take a look at some of the statistics. 80% of this data is unstructured. Means we need to develop technology can analyze unstructured data. Within enterprise, 90% of data is unstructured. On top of that, let's also take a look at it. Oops. Let's also take a look at it. 99.95% data is unanalyzed. Huge potential untapped resources here, right? So you may be asking, why only 0.05% of the data worldwide only get analyzed? There are many reasons. One is today, a lot of the analysis are still manual. Simply the scalability is not there. So we need a technology to analyze data. But the pace of technology development is not as fast as the growth of data. That's one challenge. Another challenge is the shortage of skills, right? And so as you know, in AI and data scientists in this field, talent acquisition is almost like a war. Every single organization is, try to attain people, attract top talents. Now, data quality, especially early days, data quality is also a problem. Quite often data is missing or misplaced or simply not accurate. But one aspect I'd like to bring to your attention is very important is the data privacy and data security. That's extremely important. That's also not there. That's another reason, a very important reason why the data are not tapped into it. So when they're talking about data privacy and data security, that actually has been a topic that moved from back room into boardrooms, now into our dining rooms, right? Because of that, and regulations and laws are also coming up. First, GDPR in Europe. And January of this year, California essentially issued the California Consumer Protection Act, was effective in January. So as you can see, both threats and responsibilities are greater than ever, as are the potential effects on business and society. So now comes another question is, okay, so can organizations turn a compliance challenge into an impetus for broader transformation? That's a good question, a big question. With that question in mind, IBM's Institute for Business Value, together with Oxford Economics, we did a study on the readiness of organizations in the era of privacy awareness, right? So back in 2018, right before the implementation of GDPR, we interviewed 1,500 GDPR leaders in 34 countries and representing 15 industries. Out of the 1,500 GDPR leaders, 600 of them are in West Europe because we specifically focus that region. So let me also explain to you, you may asking, who are the GDPR leaders? Some organizations are very advanced. They assign someone as the chief privacy officer. For IBM, we have a VP who is a chief privacy officer. Some organizations put this responsibility on the CIO. Some put the responsibility on the legal. Some put the responsibility in security. So different organizations do differently. So let's take a look at it. This is literally the month before GDPR implementation. only 36% say they will be fully compliant by May 2018. And 47 said, oh, they started the effort, but not there yet. And 18% said, we don't even have a plan yet. So the picture wasn't very pretty, right? And it's time to do another study and to see whether or not these organizations are ready. So now it's not all bad news. There's some good news as well. Out of those people that we interviewed and studied, and only 5% were negative. They say, well, you know, these laws and regulations, they are impediment to innovation and to how they're going to drive a data-led business model. But majority of the responses, 59% basically said, that's an opportunity for business transformation. So that's very encouraging. And only 36%, that kind of, you know, passive, yeah, it's another compliance, another regulation we have to comply. So I say overall still, majority of the business leaders and organization leaders, they believe this is a transformation opportunity. That's pretty good. All right, so that's part one. So essentially you can see the technology landscape and also the organization readiness for a privacy-aware world. Now let's take a look at some of the technical challenges. There's no doubt that AI is making data increasingly available. And I also showed you that there are tons and tons of data. Only a very small percentage have been analyzed and processed. But on the other hand, you know, every time I ask my researchers, what are the challenges? How can I help you, right? Not only in Dublin, but also in other parts of the IBM and also people outside of IBM. One thing always came up. We don't have enough data. Why is that? We have 173 zettabyte of data by 2025, but the scientists are saying we don't have enough data. There are two main reasons why we don't have enough data for the scientists. One is we don't know how to put a price tag on data, because in order for people to trade the data, to share data, you need to be able to say what's the price on it. And some people will say, oh, data is the new natural resources. Data is the new oil, but I guess oil is not a good example today, right? Given the volatility in the last few months or so. But it is true, data is not fungible. Data is not a commodity that we are familiar with, because your data is different than my data. The data may have high value to you, may not have the same value to me. So if you cannot put really a value on the data, how can you trade the data? How can you exchange data, right? That's one challenge. Actually, I like to mention, some of our scientists are actually, you know, I mean, kind of want to explore how can you put the value, you know, on the data as data goes through the AI journey. For example, how do you value the raw data versus the cleanse the data versus anonymize the data, and also later on, data is going in the form of AI model. How do you value when AI goes, when data goes through the AI process? So that's a very fascinating a research topic, but I'll save for another day. Today, let's focus on the data privacy and security. So I talked about one aspect, that's how do you value data? That's one aspect of it. And even if, you know, I can put a price on it and you're willing to pay, there comes another problem. That's a risk of data breach, right? And also, I mean, for example, if you say, okay, I'm going to provide data to a collaborator, your attorneys probably will say, stop, this is a big exposure. And the person who received the data, their legal party will tell you, okay, you tell them the data need to be fully anonymized. You think anonymization, a lot of technology, right? Yeah, but on the other hand, as I said, the data quality is also pretty bad. Quite often due to human error, sensitive data sometimes end up in a place that you don't expect to have sensitive data. So those kind of exposure are everywhere. And so quite often the legal teams on both sides will say, put the responsibility on the other party. That's another problem, which stops people from sharing and exchange data. So how do we go about that? Right, and so knowing the problems, the consumers are also getting smarter and more aware of the exposure they may experience, and they have very high expectations. According to an SAP study, nearly 80% of consumers would end brand reputation over unauthorized data usage. Doesn't really matter, it's unauthorized, it's leak, it is hacking, right? At the same time, the data breach incidences happen very often, more often than we want to see, we want to believe, and we want to, you know, deal with, right? And the saddest thing is only 4% of the breached data are encrypted. Majority of data, 96% are not. So the hackers get what they want. Only small percentage, they get data, no use. So here is essentially are the challenges from both, you know, data perspective and both from the consumer expectation perspective. As you say, trusted relationships with clients depend upon data protection. Now let's take a look at it, what we can do to protect data. I would say share with you two principles when it comes to AI in the privacy world. One is we can protect data with AI. The second is, okay, can we build AI without sharing data? So I'm going to talk about the technology in these from these two principles. Now, how do we protect data with AI? Let's take a look at some statistics first. And as you can see, we are expected to spend 1 trillion, not billion, not million, trillion T, in cybersecurity from 2017 through next year, from, you know, through 2021. That's one statistics, one number, and 1.8 million security jobs unfilled by 2022 due to skills shortage. This is everywhere, in AI, in security, in data science, right? And only 8% of security information leveraged by typical organization. This number is much better than overall data. Remember, overall data is only 0.05% are used. In security world, big increase, 8%, still not good enough. And 43% of security professionals that ignore a significant number of alarms. Why is that? Because they're overwhelmed. Let's take a look at security professionals, their day of life, right? 8 hours a day, where they spend their time. They spend enormous amount of time to do a lot of manual work, from reading through news, from copy paste information from one table to another, you name it. The picture is not very pretty. So in this particular case, and how can technology help? Obviously, we can introduce things like natural language processing, which can really help alleviate the amount of work that the security analysts spending on reading information and piece information together. Because today's natural language processing is quite sophisticated. It can not only understand the text language, right, by semantic parsing, concept extraction, it can also classify information based upon the semantic analysis and topic clustering, element classification. And you can also do a lot of retrieving with natural language processing. And also it can generate natural language, especially summarizing information for you, so which makes information absorption much, much easier. So on top of the natural language processing, which can retrieve and summarize and get information, another very important technology that is used more and more in different fields, including the security, is the knowledge graph. It is basically a semantic graphic representation of data that reveals interconnection between entities and reveal new insights. So makes, you know, the security hunting much, much easier. So we're not saying AI can replace the security analysts. What we are saying is that technologies like natural language processing and also knowledge graph can augment, can really assist the security analysis, and therefore you can much better protect your data. But on the other hand, you can say, okay, we have these technology, we can build a wall around your data, but then what? Because the idea of having data is to get the value out of data. If you lock them up, it doesn't help. Then I cannot use data. So that comes essentially to the next principle. How can you build AI without sharing data? So that way can, solve the problem, right? And there are I like to talk about two different aspects. One is share models, but not share data. And another way to do that is you can build models on protected data. That's another way to do that. So now let's first take a look at how can we share AI models without sharing data. There's a new machine learning, it's called federated machine learning, that provides exactly that functionality. And so it can keep your data private during the machine learning process. So let me share with you a scenario. Let's say Daisy, Paul, and Wendy, they all work for a multinational bank, and they work in different departments and in different geographic locations. Because of the company internal policies and also the laws in different geographies, they're not able to share data. But they have a common goal. That is to build a fraud detection using AI. So when people commit fraud, they don't really care. Quite often, it's actually those kind of crime happen across countries, especially, for example, money laundering. From one country to another country, right? From credit card department to maybe mortgage loan department. And so how can they build an AI model together for fraud detection? We can take a look at how the federated learning, machine learning works. So Daisy basically can build AI models using her local data. Paul and Wendy, they do the same. Once they're done with the model, they submit to the aggregator. The aggregator sits in the cloud somewhere. Remember, these data, Daisy, Paul, and Wendy, all sit in the local. They're not really shared in the cloud. They're all in the local database. So the aggregator then fuse the three models together from Daisy, Paul, and Wendy. And then it sends back to Daisy, Paul, and Wendy. Remember, only models, no data, sent to them. And Daisy basically updates the model using local data. Paul and Wendy do the same. After they update the model, send it back to the aggregator. This goes back and forth a few times until the model, the integrated model, or the common model that fits the needs of all three people. This is the concept of federated learning, and how can you build a common model without sharing data. And so if you want to know more information, this is essentially a EU H2020 funded project called Musketeer. If you type in on Google search Musketeer EU H2020, it'll take you to this website and describe. You can see there was a little animation about how it works, and a lot more information in terms of the federated machine learning. And in Musketeer, they have different use cases, including not only banking, but more in manufacturing settings as well. So that's one way to do that. But there are other ways to do that. As I mentioned, right, you can build models on protected data. And there are many ways. And when you're talking about protected data, sometimes people are talking about tokenizations, and people talk about masking, and there are different ways. But here, I like to share with you the two latest technology. One is the fully homomorphic encryption, and the other one is differential privacy. So now let's take a look at when it comes to encryption. Most people, I think you're familiar with the concept, right? This basically describes the encryption, how it works today. For example, Alice is dealing with sensitive data, and she needs to send her data to a third party for analysis, and Bob works for the third party. But remember, you always have somebody who's ready to steal the data. So in order to secure the transaction of data, Alice encrypts the data and sends it over to Bob. However, when Bob receives the data, he needs the encryption key to decrypt the data in order for him to do the process. There was, you can see, a weak link there. Even though Alice protected data during transaction, but Bob now is exposed for potential hackers or malicious attack, right? And so not only Alice faces the risk, so is Bob is also facing the risk of data breaches. And so how do we solve that problem? That comes to the fully homomorphic encryption. It's a mouthful when you pronounce that. So the idea of the fully homomorphic encryption is using the lattice-based cryptography, and so which guarantees the output of the calculation on the encrypted data matches exactly the data without encryption. So it guarantees the accuracy without expose any of the data privacy or data security. So this technology actually, people talked about it back in 1970s, but it wasn't until 2009, IBM's Craig Gentry made a big breakthrough. He invented fully homomorphic encryption. But back then, the computing cost was so tremendous. We only can say, yeah, we essentially proved the possibilities of such technology, but there was no feasibility because so expensive, which prevented the use of such technology for business, real business solutions. So over the last decade or so, our scientists worked really hard to bring the costs down. So by now, basically, it's quite practical. So the concept, as I mentioned, right, here is now in this particular use case, now Alice again, she now, instead of using traditional encryption, she used the fully homomorphic encryption. He sends data over to Bob. She doesn't have to give the key to Bob. So Bob also has a peace of mind. He doesn't have to bear the burden of, okay, what happened if somebody steals the data? So he can perform the computation on the encrypted data. Now, not only the data is encrypted, the model is also encrypted. Then he can send back the model together with encrypted data to Alice. Then Alice can can decrypt, and then also can look at the reports. So that's the beauty of the fully homomorphic encryption. So to further prove now this technology is feasible, and we did a pilot study together with a large bank in Brazil. It's a Banco Brasco, and so they essentially really I would call them a trailblazer in terms of adapting new technology, because banking is one of the areas you have most sensitive information. So we did a pilot with them. We published a paper together. We also had some news release. And so if you Google IBM homomorphic encryption and Bank Brasco, you can find the use case in banking. Now, it's also another interesting aspect I'd like to point out to you about this fully homomorphic encryption. It has another name called a quantum proof. In other words, in today's most sophisticated quantum computing cannot even break fully homomorphic encryption. As you can see my background, because quantum computing is actually IBM's quantum computing chandelier. And I'm very curious to see what our quantum computing scientists have to say about it. Their goal is, okay, someday we got to break that. So we'll see, who breaks who, right? And so quite interesting in terms of the encryption and also the computing's capability to break everything, right? And so we'll see the race goes on. As I mentioned, this particular technology is very, very expensive. And so we tend to reserve that use for the most mission critical data and mission critical processing data. What happens if you have to deal with a large amount of data that you can't really afford, things like homomorphic or fully homomorphic encryption? This is a challenge the US Census is facing, because this year they conducted another census. You're talking about 330 million of citizens' data, right? And the Bureau essentially has a responsibility. So the data stewardship is central to the Census Bureau's mission to produce high quality statistics about the people and economy of the United States. The stake is very, very high. But let's take a look at the challenge. Every time you publish a statistic, you reveal a small amount of private information. So the more statistics you publish, the more accuracy you want to achieve, the more likelihood you will expose private information. And so to solve that problem, the US Census Bureau, this year, they implemented differential privacy in the census analysis. So what is differential privacy? The key idea is blur the data. Basically, differential privacy uses mathematical noise to preserve privacy and confidentiality while allow the population statistics to be observed. So that's the beauty of it. So I borrowed this picture from the US Census Bureau because I think it explains the concept of differential privacy really, really well. Basically, if you want total privacy, right, and perfect privacy, then you suffer the accuracy of the output because you have to introduce very large noise. Then the data you may no longer match the original data set. But on the other hand, if you want 100% accurate output, then you sacrifice privacy, right, or confidentiality. So the concept of epsilon is a privacy loss budget. So how much risk you can take in privacy loss and still get meaningful and reasonable accurate data. So basically in the spectrum, you can decide where I want to be in different status. For example, if I look at, race, because most people essentially, know your race, right? Maybe the risk is not as high as if you want to know, say, your salary or your age, right? Or your other private information. So that's basically the concept of the differential privacy. And so from IBM's perspective, we're not only looking at using differential privacy on data, on raw data, but also we are looking at how can we use differential privacy to protect our AI models. And this week, we essentially release a new version of that, and we make it open source. And so you can check them out in the GitHub following this link, or you can simply basically Google IBM Differential Privacy Library. You'll be able to find the information because very handy. You can use it when you build AI models, but I'm not going to promise all AI models, right? The most common models that we make sure that we have the tool is going to fit with, is going to work for the most common models. So that's essentially the differential privacy. The concept of differential privacy, as you can see, is a technology that they use in the most mission critical area where you have to deal with a very large amount of data. And we also make sure that it works in the AI model as well. Okay, so this basically sort of shared with the technology. Now, it's a very interesting relationship between AI and data I'd like to share with you. As you can see, they have dependencies on each other. So AI, you really cannot have AI without data. Building AI depend on data. But on the other hand, as AI is getting more and more advanced, it is the most powerful tool to protect the data. So you can see the relation between two. So this is a very positive relationship, and over time, hopefully the data becomes more higher quality and it's protected with the high quality data, and also the the ease of the concern that we no longer need to worry too much about sharing data. More data will be available to build AI models. So it's a very positive back and forth. And so as I said, the two principal recap here is start by protecting data with AI, and but more importantly, we want to make sure we unlock value by creating models without sharing data. So all these are different technology that you need to be aware. So normally I would wrap up my presentation here, but as I said in the beginning of my presentation, you're all living and experiencing through this. We're in the middle of a pandemic, right? And so, which also raises another question about privacy in a crisis situation, because I mean, since the pandemic, there were at least 30 countries, this number is increasing every single day, released mobile tracking apps. So are you concerned about your privacy? Basically, I'd like to end my presentation by raising a question to you about your concern. Where do you draw the line, privacy versus some of the benefit we can get from tracking or from sharing information? So it's a good question to think about, and we are certainly thinking about it, and would love to hear from the audience about your view. All right, so this basically concludes my presentation, and again, like to thank you very much, and I open for, we still have a few minutes maybe for some questions.
Thanks, Ruoyi. That was great, very, very interesting. Lots of interesting, lots of food for thought. So we have a few questions already. So I'll just start with the first one. What's the difference between AI and machine learning? Are they one and the same?
Yeah, so that's such a good. Sorry, go ahead.
Open a lecture of probably a couple of hours, but I think we need to keep that condensed.
Yeah. So that's an excellent question, because we also struggled in the beginning, right? And so AI is basically a very broad category. So machine learning is one aspect of AI. You have machine learning, you have deep learning, right? You have transfer learning and reinforced learning. So there are different learnings within AI. Then natural language processing is also AI, and speech recognition is also using AI. So AI basically is a very broad term.
Yeah. Okay, so next question from Tim. Is IBM doing any research into embodiment of AI?
So it depends upon what do you mean by embodiment?
Okay, so I'll keep going with the question, it's a bit long. So that the scope of sensors involved is not limited to audio-visual perception, and so the learning occurs over multiple years in a situated manner, similar to how humans and animals learn.
Would you please repeat the question again?
So is IBM doing any research into embodiment of AI? Which means, it explains, so that the scope of sensors involved is not limited to audio-visual perception, and so that learning occurs over multiple years in a situated manner, similar to how humans and animals learn.
I see. That's also another very good question. The answer is there are multiple ways to do that, right? Like, for example, I mean, a human brain works neurons, and so the neural network is another aspect of learning. How do you do the neural network and understand how that's going to, to be, how similar that is to the human brain? But we focus more on the enterprise part of it, meaning what are the enterprise needs? For example, natural language processing, extremely important, because 90% of the enterprise documents in unstructured data. So we tend to focus, from IBM perspective, we tend to focus more on the needs of enterprise. Like for banking, for example, security is very important. How do we apply AI, federated learning, for example, in security? So our focus is very much around enterprise needs.
All right. Sorry, just before I go to the next question, can I ask Rob to stop sharing the slides so we can see Ruoyi on the full screen?
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. So we have another question from Ulrich. He asks, I wonder about transparency in how personal data is being used. Will this become more important in the future to preserve the trust of consumers and partners?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I can see the trend that GDPR started in Europe, and California being always the leader, technology leader, right? We also implemented the Consumers Protection Act. And so I think more and more people, they demand privacy, because it is true. Otherwise, I mean, people feel uncomfortable sharing anything. But on the other hand, you have sensors everywhere. People have carried their cellular phones, their monitors. And so, so definitely, I think, I mean, as citizens, I think we demand more and more privacy.
Yeah, I think on one side, GDPR has probably shifted, say, created a new paradigm in terms of privacy requirements, expectations also for citizens. Matthew is asking, what is a reasonable minimum education that we should ensure for everyone to achieve with respect to computers and AI going forward?
Oh, that's a tough question. What's a minimum requirement? That's a tough question. I don't really know if I have a good answer.
I think,
because I mean, you learn, right? Even my father in his 80s, I mean, he's not really going to school anymore, but he needs to learn how to use a smartphone to communicate with me, right? And I mean, that's a minimum he can do. But I don't necessarily think we only need to rely on education, because we also learn from our work. Like, I never knew AI when I was in, even though I got my PhD, right? I never learned AI. So you learn on the job as well. So I think learning, I won't say the minimum requirement. Of course, you still need some minimum requirement, but most of the new things, especially for the young generation, you are expected to learn in your job and in your future life, because I mean, that's the way it is, because the technology advancement, the pace is so fast. 4 years of college, another 4 years, you need another college degree, right? So the learning will be very different in the future than it is now. You just, making me think about it. I think the learning will be very different process than thinking about 4 years or maybe getting a PhD and you're done. No, it's going to be continuous learning throughout your life. That's my advice. May or may not be right, but that's what I see the trend.
Well, for what it's worth, I completely agree with you. My approach to learning is a lifelong learning, particularly around these topics which are changing constantly on a daily basis.
Yeah.
We have a question from Hanan. He asks, what are your thoughts on AI explainability with regards to data privacy?
That's a very good question. So typically right now, what we typically do is explain why we come up with certain recommendation, why we come up with a predictive model, right? And how decision is made to pick this model with another model. And not so much on, to ensure, maybe it's a good way to ensure them, say, yes, your privacy is protected, by the way. And as part of explainability, right, we use such and such technology, so your data is not exposed through this AI process. So far, it's typically explain the process, not necessarily to assure people, yeah, the data is, sort of like protected, but that's given. Typically, it's a legal requirement for many companies and organizations. You got to protect the data.
Yeah, so Uchenna, I hope that I pronounced that right, is asking, is IBM doing anything on the minimization or removal of bias in AI algorithms that come from the design of the algorithms, not the bias from the data?
Yeah, very much so. So if you look at IBM called AI 360, and we're basically going through the open source. I mean, it is open source already. We have a tool set that was published, if I remember correctly, 2 years ago. We had a workshop together, with MIT, with other schools, and doing other leading AI experts talking about AI fairness, and which included, the bias, data bias, and model itself. And so we have an expert in research as well, and she's leading this effort, very vocal about it. And so we take this very, very seriously. So if you Google IBM AI 360, and you can find our toolkit that's open to everyone.
Okay. Then I think we have time for another 1 or 2 questions there. So Josh is asking, how do you see quantum computing potentially changing AI and machine learning?
Very much so. I would say they complement also, because I mean, if you take like quantum, it really deals with very, very complex problems, not necessarily large volume of data, right? And that's why I think the quantum versus fully morphic encryption, it's such interesting scenario, right? the people working on the fully homomorphic encryption say, hey, we're quantum proof, right? The quantum people say, hey, someday we're going to break you to prove these, how sophisticated the quantum is. They essentially, I mean, some cases probably can replace one, replace the other, but in most cases they complement each other. And the quantum is still in its very early stage, and we're very much focused still on building the system. I mean, the applications are still very limited.
Mm-hmm. I think we have time for one last question. Julian is asking, what do you think are the risks that regulation within data or AI could be defense, in inverted commas, around the industry, which will make new business, for new companies, harder to start a business?
Yeah, that is always like, I would say, a dilemma, and also the balance act. Same thing is true with the, the contact tracing with COVID-19. And so the question is, as citizens, how much are you willing to sacrifice your data versus, how much are you willing to protect your privacy, right? But then as more and more technology is available, there are ways to protect data. Hopefully those technology become cheaper and cheaper. That'll become part of the data package. You want to have data, here's the tool, however you want to protect it, right? And so that becomes then a non-issue. So hopefully, we're going to continue to focus on the technology advancement. And so that'll make sharing data much easier.
Okay, I think we run out of time. We had other questions there outstanding, but unfortunately we run out of time. So thanks, Ruoyi, for your time, for accepting our invitation, and for this great presentation. It was great to have you.
Yeah, thank you, everybody, and stay safe, and hopefully see you soon in person.